Hash, 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 asterisk, asterisk. Part 1. Grain and Gossip, asterisk, asterisk. The wind had a name in Dry Creek, and in the summer of 1878 that name was Furnace. It was a physical thing, a presence that scoured the paint from clapboard buildings until they showed the pale, thirsty wood beneath. It lifted the red dust from the single main street and swirled it into every crack and crevice, into the lungs of men and the eyes of horses. The sun wasn't a friend. It was a hammer, beating down on the parched earth until the very idea of a cloud seemed like a story from a distant land. Eli Rollins felt it in the cracked leather of his saddle and the dry rasp in his own throat. He rode his steady buckskin, dusty from the trail, into town with a singular purpose burning brighter than the midday sun grain. The drought had scorched his pastures north of town, leaving his small herd of horses to chew on brittle stalks that offered more grit than nutrition. The grain at Morrison's Mercantile was his only hope to see them through to the first rains, whenever the heavens decided to remember places like Dry Creek existed. He was a man in his early 30s, with shoulders broadened by work, not by brawling. His face was tanned and lined by the sun, and his eyes, a clear, steady gray, held a quietness that men often mistook for simplicity. It wasn't. It was the quiet of a man who spent more time in the company of horses and horizon than he did with people, a man who had a past he didn't speak of, a shadow of a mistake he was trying to outride by living a simple, decent life. That was the goal he hadn't yet named for himself, to be a man of some small, quiet worth. Dry Creek didn't make decency easy. As he dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post outside the Mercantile, he could feel the town's gaze. It wasn't a welcoming one. It was the weary, suspicious stare of a community baked brittle by hardship. Men in sweat-stained hats watched from the shaded porch of the saloon, their talk dying to a low murmur. A woman swept her porch with short, angry strokes, raising more dust than she cleared. This was a town holding its breath, waiting for the next thing to go wrong. The bell above the door of Morrison's Mercantile gave a thin, cheerless jingle. The air inside was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and the cloying sweetness of penny candy, all overlaid with a film of red dust. Chester Morrison stood behind the counter, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, his face perpetually slick with a sheen of sweat. He had the eyes of a man who could weigh a soul and charge for the privilege. Lounging near a barrel of pickles were Tom Garrett and Pike Stevens. Garrett was a ranch hand from the Double K, a swaggering sort with a cruel twist to his mouth. Stevens, his boss, was bigger, quieter, and somehow more menacing for it. A bull of a man who led a rough crew of cattle drivers, and leaning against the far wall, polishing his badge with a deliberate slowness, was Deputy Wade, a man who wore his authority like a club, always ready to swing it. Eli gave a curt nod to the room, which was met with silence. He was used to it. He was a solitary man, not part of the town's tight-knit web of alliances and grudges. He was just here for grain. But then the bell jingled again, and the atmosphere in the store shifted, curdling like milk left in the sun. Miriam Harper stepped inside, followed by a small girl with wide, solemn eyes who clutched a fold of her mother's faded calico dress. The woman was perhaps 26 or 7, with a straightness to her spine that defied the slump of her surroundings. Her face was plain, but possessed a calm strength, her hands clasped in front of her, weathered but steady. She moved with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate the men in the room. The whispers started instantly, a dry hiss like snakes in the grass. Eli knew the stories. Everyone in Dry Creek knew them. Miriam Harper was the widow whose husband had died suddenly a year ago from a fever, the town doctor had said. But gossip was a more powerful physician, and it had diagnosed a different cause. The word poison was never said aloud in her presence, but it hung in the air around her, invisible and suffocating. She was an outcast, judged and sentenced in the court of public opinion. Mrs. Harper, Morrison said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "What can I do for you today?" "Flour, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice low and even. "And salt." The little girl, Sarah, peeked out from behind her mother's skirt, her gaze falling on the jars of candy. Miriam gently squeezed her daughter's shoulder. A silent command. Morrison heaved a sack of flour onto the counter, raising a puff of white. He then added a small bag of salt. "That'll be $1.20. Eli's brows furrowed slightly. He'd bought flour just last week. The price was steep, even for drought times. Miriam opened her small reticule and carefully counted out the coins. Her movements were precise, betraying none of the anxiety she must have felt under the weight of 4 pairs of male eyes. She laid the coins on the counter. There was a small, agonizing pause. "I'm short," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But in the silence of the store, it was a shout. I only have $1. Morrison sighed, a theatrical display of impatience. "Well, ma'am, prices are what they are. Can't give away goods." "Ain't that the truth?" Tom Garrett drawled from his perch on the pickle barrel. "Some folks just seem to attract bad luck. Husbands, money. It all just withers away." Pike Stevens chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Maybe she's got a talent for making things disappear." Miriam's face remained a mask of calm, but Eli saw the knuckles of her free hand turn white. She drew her daughter closer, her body a shield against the venomous words. Sarah buried her face in her mother's dress. Deputy Wade said nothing, just continued to polish his badge, a faint, smug smile on his lips. His silence was a form of endorsement. Something inside Eli, something he'd kept buried under years of minding his own business, shifted. It was the sight of the little girl, the quiet, unbending dignity of the woman, and the ugly pleasure on the faces of the men. It was the smell of a pack of coyotes cornering a lone doe. He stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under his weight. "Chester," Eli said, his voice level. He pulled a few coins from his pocket and placed them on the counter. "Add this to my bill for the grain. Reckon this'll cover the lady's flour." He looked Morrison square in the eye. "And it'll even us out. You miscalculated the cost of those nails I bought last week. Charged me 20 cents too much." The lie was as smooth as worn leather, plausible enough to give Morrison a way out without losing face. But everyone in the room knew what it was. It was a shield, and Eli had just placed himself in front of Miriam Harper. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Tom Garrett's sneer faded, replaced by a look of open hostility. Pike Stevens slowly pushed himself off the barrel, his sheer size an intimidation tactic. Deputy Wade finally stopped polishing his badge and watched Eli with a new, sharp interest. Morrison, his face flushed, swept all the coins into his drawer with a clatter. "As you wish. Rollins." The way he said the name made it sound like an insult. Miriam turned to Eli. Her eyes, a deep, tired blue, met his. She opened her mouth to speak, but he gave a slight shake of his head. He didn't want thanks. He didn't want to be involved. He just wanted the injustice of the moment to end. She closed her mouth and gave him a single, solemn nod. It was a nod that acknowledged the debt, the risk, and the unexpected kindness. She gathered her flour and salt, took her daughter's hand, and walked out of the store, her back ramrod straight. Eli turned back to the counter. 100 pounds of grain. Chester. As Morrison went to the back, Garrett sauntered over, getting mighty chivalrous. "Rollins, you best be careful what stray you decide to feed. Some of 'em bite." "I just believe in an honest tally." "Garrett," Eli said, not looking at him. Nothing more. He paid for his grain, hoisted the heavy sack over his shoulder, and walked out into the blinding sunlight, the hostile quiet of the store clinging to him like a burr. He felt a fool. He'd come to town to solve one problem and had just walked headfirst into a bigger one. All he wanted was to be left alone, to work his land and tend his animals. As he was untying his horse, A sudden commotion erupted from the south end of town. A shout, followed by the sharp crack of a gunshot that wasn't from a hunter. Horses whinnied in panic. A cloud of dust billowed up near the bend in the road where the stagecoach line ran. Eli instinctively pushed the heavy grain sack against his horse's flank, using the animal as cover, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. Men spilled out of the saloon, their card games and drinks forgotten. Deputy Wade came running out of the mercantile, his hand on his own holstered pistol. It was over in less than a minute. A riderless horse galloped past, wild-eyed. The mail wagon, which had been carrying the monthly payroll for the stage line, sat askew in the road. Its driver slumped over the seat. Another man lay in the dust nearby. Two figures on horseback were already disappearing into the hills, leaving a trail of settling dust. The whole town seemed to converge on the spot. Eli stayed where he was, watching. He saw Miriam Harper, frozen halfway down the street, clutching her daughter. She had been on her way home when the ambush happened. Then Tom Garrett, who had been among the first to reach the wagon, held something up. It was a piece of dark fabric, a woman's shawl with a simple embroidered pattern. "Well now, look what we have here," Garrett yelled, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "Dropped in the dirt right next to the wagon. Ain't this yours? Widow Harper." Every head turned, every eye fixed on Miriam. The whispers started again. But this time, they weren't hisses. They were the hungry growls of a mob that had found its quarry. The earlier suspicion in the store now had evidence. A woman who could make a husband disappear could certainly have a hand in making a payroll pouch vanish. The logic was cruel, swift, and absolute. Eli watched as Miriam's face, already pale, lost its last trace of color, but she didn't falter. She pulled her daughter tight against her side, her chin lifted, facing the silent accusation of an entire town. She stood alone, an island in a sea of suspicion. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the dust-filled sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. The heat of the day was finally breaking, but a different kind of heat was rising in Dry Creek. Eli finished tying the heavy sack of grain to his saddle, his movements slow and deliberate. His mission was complete. He had what he came for. He could mount his horse, ride north, and leave the town and its troubles behind him. He could forget the look in the widow's eyes and the cruel satisfaction on Tom Garrett's face. That was the sensible thing to do. That was the safe thing to do. But as he put his foot in the stirrup, he glanced back one last time. He saw the small, defiant figure of Miriam Harper, holding her child's hand, bathed in the red light of the dying sun. She was surrounded by the town, yet utterly alone, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that leaving wasn't an option anymore, not for a man trying to find some small, quiet worth. I rode into Dry Creek for nothing more than a sack of grain, a simple need to keep my horses alive. I left with the weight of a widow's trouble on my shoulders. A woman who had, in the space of a single dusty afternoon, altered the path of my entire life. ************* Part 2. A Stain on Honor **********. The morning after the robbery, the red dust of Dry Creek seemed to carry more than just dirt. It carried whispers. By noon, Deputy Wade gave those whispers a voice. He didn't post a formal notice or convene a hearing. He simply stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, a position that gave him a clear view of the entire street, and held court for anyone who would listen. And in a town starved for drama, everyone listened. Eli was across the street, talking to the blacksmith about a new set of shoes for his buckskin. When Wade started his pronouncement, the deputy's voice was loud, carrying the easy authority of a man who knows he won't be challenged. "We're still looking into the matter of the payroll robbery," Wade announced, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "But I can tell you this much. That shawl we found, it belonged to the widow Harper. She claims it was stolen from her clothesline last week." He paused, letting a cynical smirk spread across his face. "Mighty convenient. Ain't it for an item to go missing and then turn up right where a federal pouch goes missing too? There ain't enough evidence for a formal arrest just yet, but she's our primary person of interest. I'd advise decent folk to be cautious. The word hung in the hot, still air asterisk, cautious asterisk. It was a brand, and Wade had just pressed it onto Miriam Harper's name. He had declared her guilty without a trial, turning suspicion into fact in the minds of the townspeople. Eli saw heads nodding in agreement. He saw the self-righteous glint in Chester Morrison's eyes as the shopkeeper watched from his doorway. He saw Tom Garrett leaning against the saloon, a triumphant sneer on his face. The stain, once a whisper, was now a public proclamation. A cold knot tightened in Eli's gut. This was exactly the kind of trouble he'd spent years avoiding. It was messy, it was unfair, and it had nothing to do with him. He had his own ranch to run, his own horses to save. But the image of Miriam standing alone in the sunset, her small daughter clinging to her leg, was burned into his mind. He'd stepped in once. Walking away now felt like a different kind of wrong. It felt like cowardice. He paid the blacksmith, his movements stiff. Instead of riding north, back to the solitude of his homestead, he turned his horse south, toward the edge of town. Miriam Harper's home was a testament to a life lived on the brink. It was a small, clapboard house that had gone too long without paint, its wood weathered to a silvery gray. The porch sagged on one side, and several shingles were missing from the roof, leaving dark, vulnerable patches. What should have been a vegetable garden was a square of baked, cracked earth. But there were signs of a determined fight against the decay. A small, clean-swept porch, a row of carefully tended but wilting flowers in a window box, and a single, patched curtain hanging straight in the window. The well was the worst of it. Its stone lining was cracked, and the bucket rope was frayed. Eli peered down into the darkness and could see only a sliver of murky water at the bottom. A leaking well for a woman whose reputation was leaking away every minute. He dismounted, pulling a small cloth sack from his saddlebags. He walked to the door and knocked. It took a long moment for the door to open. Miriam stood there, her face etched with a weary tension. She wasn't surprised to see him, but she wasn't welcoming either. Her pride was a fortress, and he was an outsider breaching the walls. "Mr. Rollins," she said, her voice flat. "Ma'am?" He held out the sack. "Brought you something." She looked at the sack, then back at his face, her eyes searching for his motive. "I can't pay you for your help yesterday, and I can't take charity today." "It ain't charity," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "It's seed, drought-resistant beans and squash. My father taught me a few things about dry farming. This land, it's not dead yet." He walked past her to the failed garden patch. He knelt, crumbling the hard-packed dirt between his fingers. "You need to build up small ridges of earth. Like this," he said, drawing a line in the dust with his finger. "Plant the seeds in the trough. When you water, the ridges hold it in, guide it right to the roots. And if you cover the soil with a layer of straw, it'll hold the moisture in from the sun." He wasn't just giving her seeds, he was giving her a strategy. It was a language of survival he understood better than the language of people. He looked up and found her watching him, her expression unreadable. From inside the house, Sarah appeared, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes fixed on Eli with a child's unfiltered curiosity. Miriam finally took the sack of seeds from him. Her fingers brushed his, and the touch was as brief and dry as the air between them. "Thank you," she said, the words costing her. "The roof needs patching before the rains come," he said, glancing up, "and that porch post is about to give way. I'm aware of what my house needs, Mr. Rollins." Her self-reliance was a shield, sharp and formidable. "I've got time," he said simply, ignoring the dismissal. And so began a strange, unspoken arrangement. Eli started spending his afternoons at the Harper place. He didn't ask permission. He just showed up and got to work. He started with the roof, his hammer echoing in the quiet heat. Miriam would bring him a dipper of water from the near-empty well, her thanks always silent, conveyed only in the gesture itself. They barely spoke, but in the shared space of labor, a fragile trust began to form. The town noticed. When Eli went to Morrison's for supplies, the storekeeper was coldly efficient. The usual crowd of loafers was there, and their silence was louder and more hostile than their usual gossip. Tom Garrett made a point of following him out. "Heard you're spending your time being the widow's hired man," Garrett sneered, leaning against a post. "She paying you well, or is it a different kind of payment you're after?" Eli kept walking. "Some of us see a job that needs doing and do it. Garrett, you should try it sometime." The rumors started to attach themselves to him. Too, he was a fool, they said, taken in by a manipulative woman. Or worse, he was her accomplice, helping her lay low after the robbery. His simple act of kindness was being twisted into something ugly. One afternoon, while he was bracing the weak side of the small barn, Miriam came out with a plate of cornbread. It was probably made from the flour he'd helped her buy. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, handing him the plate. "You're making enemies." "Already had 'em," Eli replied. "Taking a piece of the bread. Just didn't know their names before." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah, who had been sitting on the steps, watching Eli with an unnerving intensity. She walked over to him, her small face serious. "Mr. Rollins," she asked, her voice small but clear. "Yes, Sarah." She looked from him to her mother, then back again. "Are you a good man or a bad man?" The question struck Eli with the force of a physical blow. It was a child's question, simple and profound, cutting through all the layers of gossip and reputation and suspicion. It went straight to the heart of the matter, to the past he was trying to outrun and the man he was trying to become. Was he good? He'd done things he wasn't proud of. Was he bad? He was trying not to be. He looked at the earnest, trusting face of the little girl and found he had no easy answer. "I'm trying to be a good one," he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate in his mouth. Sarah seemed to consider this. She gave a small nod, as if his answer was sufficient for now, and went back to the steps. Eli looked at Miriam and saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She had likely asked herself the same question about him. The next day, he started on the sagging porch. He needed to dig new holes and set a stronger post. Miriam came out to help. Her sleeves rolled up. The work was heavy, and they fell into a rhythm, heaving and digging and measuring without the need for words. He had just finished setting the new post in its hole and was holding it steady while she packed the dirt and rocks around its base. It was awkward, tiring work. The sun beat down on them. A strand of her dark hair had come loose and stuck to her damp forehead. "A little more on this side," he grunted, shifting his weight to keep the heavy timber plumb. She moved to comply, her shoulder brushing against his arm. As she reached down for another rock, her hand covered his where he gripped the base of the post. Her skin was warm, her hand calloused but gentle. The contact lasted only a second, a fleeting, clumsy moment born of shared labor. But in that second, the world seemed to stop. The hammering sun, the dry wind, the judging eyes of the town, it all fell away. There was only the rough texture of the wood, the shared strain in their muscles, and the startling, unexpected warmth of her touch. They both pulled back at the same time, a flush rising on Miriam's cheeks. Eli cleared his throat, suddenly finding the post intensely interesting. "That should hold it," he said, his voice husky. Yes, she agreed, her gaze fixed on the ground. "It should." The post stood straight and true, a solid, tangible piece of progress. It was just a piece of wood, but it felt like more. It was a defense, a small piece of order in the encroaching chaos. As he gathered his tools to leave for the day, Eli looked at the small house. It still looked beleaguered, still threatened, but with its patched roof and sturdy new porch post, it no longer looked like it was giving up. And as he rode away, the weight of Sarah's question echoed in his mind. Not as a judgment, but as a challenge he was finally, unexpectedly, ready to meet. *******, Part 3, The Wildfire Night *****. Nature, in its own time, passed its own judgment on Dry Creek. The drought had been a slow verdict, a gradual tightening of the fist. The wildfire was the final, brutal swing of a hammer. It began as a plume of smoke on the western hills, a smudge against the vast, indifferent blue sky that the town watched with a detached fatalism. Fires happened, but then the wind, which had been a steady, hot breath from the south for weeks, began to shift and gust with a wild, unpredictable temper. Eli was at Miriam's, finishing the last of the repairs on her small barn. When he smelled it, it wasn't the familiar scent of a cooking fire. It was the sharp, acrid odor of pine and dry chaparral burning hot and fast. He straightened up, his eyes scanning the horizon. The plume of smoke was no longer a distant smudge. It had grown into a roiling, angry cloud, its belly glowing with a hellish orange light. And the wind was now blowing directly from the west, a straight, malevolent line from the fire to them. "Miriam!" he yelled, his voice sharp with an urgency that cut through the afternoon quiet. She came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, Sarah trailing behind her. She followed his gaze, and her face, already so practiced in holding back emotion, tightened. "How long do we have?" she asked. There was no panic in her voice, only a chilling pragmatism. "Not long enough," Eli said. "Already moving. The wind's pushing it fast. Get Sarah in the root cellar. Soak every blanket and rug you own in the well. We need to cover the roof." The well, already dangerously low, was their only source of water. Miriam didn't question him. She grabbed Sarah's hand. "You heard the man, sweetheart. It's a game. We're going to camp in the cellar for a little while." She spoke with a forced calm that was more reassuring than any shouted command. As Miriam disappeared inside, Eli grabbed an axe and a shovel. He ran to the edge of the small yard, the place where the parched grass met the wild, untamed brush of the hillside. He began to work with a ferocious, focused energy, swinging the axe, clearing a wide strip of land down to the bare earth. The dry brush crackled and snapped, tinder dry and ready to explode. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't slow. He was in a race with the wind, and he knew he was losing. Miriam emerged, her arms laden with wet blankets. She was a small, determined figure against the backdrop of the advancing smoke. Together, they clambered onto the low roof of the house, spreading the heavy, dripping fabric over the dry wooden shingles. Embers, carried on the wind like malevolent sprites, were already starting to fall around them, hissing as they hit the damp cloth. The air grew thick and hot, making each breath a painful, rasping effort. Below them, Sarah, who had been placed safely in the cellar, began to cough. The sound, a thin, desperate punctuation to the growing roar of the fire. Miriam's calm finally wavered. Her eyes darted toward the cellar door, her body torn between protecting her home and protecting her child. "I've got the roof!" Eli shouted over the wind. "Go to her, keep a wet cloth over her face." As Miriam scrambled down, the first wave of real heat hit. It was a physical blow, a blast from an open oven that stole the air from his lungs. The sky was no longer blue, but a churning, terrifying canvas of orange, red, and black. The fire was upon them. Through the smoke, he saw two riders approaching. For a wild, irrational moment, he thought it was help. Then he recognized the broad, bullish shape of Pike Stevens and the wiry swagger of Tom Garrett. They reined in their horses at the edge of the property, their faces illuminated by the fire's demonic glow. "Looks like you got some trouble," Rollins Garrett yelled, a grin splitting his smoke-smudged face. "Need a hand?" "The barn," Eli shouted, his voice raw. "Get the horses out!" He didn't trust them, but he had no choice. The small barn, which housed Miriam's 2 workhorses and her late husband's prized breeding stallion, was directly in the fire's path. He watched as they dismounted and ran toward the barn, disappearing into the swirling smoke. Eli turned his attention back to the house, beating out a small fire that had started at the edge of a blanket where it had already dried from the intense heat. The sound of splintering wood drew his attention back to the barn. He saw Garrett and Pike emerge, not with the horses, but leading only the stallion. They weren't leading it to safety in the cleared yard. They were pulling it away from the property, toward the dark, unburned hills to the south. Thieves. They were using the fire as cover to steal the most valuable animal she owned. A cold rage, clean and pure, cut through Eli's fear. He leaped from the roof, landing hard, his ankles jarring from the impact. He ignored the pain and sprinted through the shower of embers toward the 2 men. "Let the horse go," he roared. Garrett turned, his grin gone, replaced by a snarl. Pike Stevens let go of the stallion's lead and moved to block Eli's path. The horse, terrified by the fire and the shouting, reared and bolted into the smoky darkness. "Should have minded your own business, cowboy," Pike growled, lowering his shoulder to charge. Eli didn't have time for a fair fight. He sidestepped Pike's rush, grabbed a heavy bucket half filled with muddy water, and swung it with all his might. It caught Pike square in the head with a sickening thud. The big man staggered, stunned, and Eli followed it with a hard right fist to his jaw. Pike went down like a felled tree. Garrett, seeing his partner fall, pulled a knife. "You'll regret that." Rollins. They circled each other in the hellish clearing between the burning barn and the threatened house. The fire roared around them, a deafening, elemental witness to their small, human conflict. Smoke burned Eli's lungs, and his eyes streamed with tears, but his focus was locked on the glint of steel in Garrett's hand. It was then that a new sound pierced the chaos, a child's weak, continuous coughing, followed by a choked cry from Miriam. "She can't breathe. Oh God, she can't breathe." The cry came from the cellar entrance, where the smoke was now thick and pooling like a toxic fog. The fight with Garrett, the stolen horse, the fire itself, it all vanished from Eli's mind. There was only the sound of that child choking. He shoved Garrett back, a desperate, powerful move that sent the other man stumbling, and turned to run toward the cellar. But a figure emerged from the smoke before he could take 2 steps. It was Doc Winters, his face pale, his fine town coat smudged with soot. He must have seen the fire from town and ridden out, a frantic, uncharacteristic act of concern. The doctor didn't hesitate. He plunged into the thick smoke at the cellar entrance and emerged a moment later with Sarah in his arms. The little girl was limp, her face a terrifying shade of gray. He laid her on a cleared patch of ground, away from the worst of the smoke, and immediately began to work, pressing on her small chest, breathing into her mouth. For the first time since Eli had known him, Doc Winters wasn't thinking about public opinion or his reputation. He was just a doctor, fighting for a life. Garrett, seeing his opportunity, scrambled away into the smoke. Eli let him go. He stumbled over to where the doctor worked, Miriam kneeling beside him, her face a mask of pure terror, her hand stroking her daughter's hair. "Come on, child," the doctor muttered, his voice a low, desperate prayer. "Breathe, just breathe." And then, a small, shuddering gasp. Sarah's chest hitched, and she began to cough, a weak, wet sound, but it was the most beautiful sound Eli had ever heard. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with tears and confusion. The worst had passed. The main front of the fire, driven by the furious wind, roared past them, consuming the dry brush on the hill and moving on. The immediate danger was over, leaving behind a smoldering, blackened landscape. The dawn that followed was not the color of hope. It was a uniform, soul-crushing gray. The sun a pale, impotent disk behind a haze of smoke. The world smelled of ash and loss. Miriam's house stood, scarred and soaked, but intact. The barn, however, was a ruin. One wall had completely collapsed, and the roof was a blackened skeleton open to the sky. The two workhorses, which Garrett and Pike had left trapped, had been saved by Eli after the doctor took over, but they were singed and terrified. The stallion was gone. Doc Winters, his face grim, confirmed Sarah would be all right. The smoke had been close to overwhelming her, but she was young and resilient. He looked from the exhausted mother to Eli, his expression one of newfound respect and shared trauma. "You did a good thing here, Rollins," he said, before mounting his horse for the ride back to town. It was a small sentence, but it was an alliance forged in fire. As the sun rose higher, Miriam stood looking at the wreckage of the barn. Her hands were black with soot, her face smudged. She finally looked at Eli, and the wall of her composure, held up for so long, finally crumbled. "They take everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "First my husband's name, then my credit, my reputation. Now his horse. It's all I had left of him. I feel like I'm standing on a tiny piece of ground, and the whole world is trying to wash it out from under me." Eli looked at her, at the soot on her strong hands, a testament to her fight. He looked at the smoking ruins and the saved house. He had come to this place to offer a handful of seeds, a few hours of labor. He had tried to keep his distance, to offer help without offering himself, but that was no longer possible. The fire had burned away the space between them. He was no longer just a neighbor helping out. He was on her piece of ground now, standing with her against the flood. "They didn't wash it away tonight," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's still here, and you're not standing on it alone." The rumors in town shifted the next day, just as he knew they would. The story was not of a widow's bravery or a neighbor's help. The tale spun by Garrett was of a fire started by the widow's carelessness, a fire that had endangered them all. She wasn't just a thief. She was a jinx, a magnet for disaster. The gossip, fanned by the flames of the wildfire, now had a new, more dangerous heat. The stain on her honor had been seared in by the flames. ###***, Part 4, the black silver vein ****. The ashes from the fire had barely settled before the next assault began. It arrived not with the roar of flames, but with the crisp, quiet rustle of paper. A man from the Dry Creek Bank, looking uncomfortable in his starched collar, rode out to Miriam's property and handed her an official-looking envelope. Eli, who was helping her sift through the barn's wreckage for salvageable tools, watched as she opened it. He saw the color drain from her face, a new and terrifying paleness that had nothing to do with the fire. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She handed him the letter without a word. It was a notice of foreclosure. According to the bank, her late husband, Frank, had taken out a substantial loan against the property, a loan that was now in default. The letter stated that the bank, under the direction of its president, Mr. Clay Caldwell, would be seizing the land and all assets, including water rights, in 30 days. Eli read it twice. It made no sense. Frank Harper had been a proud, hard-working man, not the type to take on a debt he couldn't manage, and the amount listed was staggering, far more than the small homestead was worth. "This can't be right," Eli said, handing the paper back. "It doesn't matter if it's right," Miriam replied, her voice hollow. "It's legal. It has a stamp from the bank and the signature of the most powerful man in this county. What do I have? Nothing." She folded the paper with a final, defeated precision. The fire had taken her past. This letter was trying to steal her future. The name Clay Caldwell was the real poison in Dry Creek. He was a man who rarely dirtied his own hands. He sat in his polished office at the bank, a pillar of the community, while men like Pike Stevens and Deputy Wade acted as his calloused fingers, squeezing the town for every ounce of profit. Eli had always known this in a distant way, but now the banker's reach was no longer abstract. It was right here, in this letter. threatening to crush the small world he had stepped into. He knew then that mending fences and patching roofs was no longer enough. The problem wasn't a broken post. It was a rotten foundation. He had to confront the system, and that meant understanding it. His investigation began not at the bank, but at the blacksmith's forge. It was a hunch, a loose thread from the night of the fire. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, confirmed he had shoed the stallion for Frank Harper a month before he died. But as Eli was about to leave, he asked another question. "Gus, you ever do any custom work? Something distinctive?" Gus wiped his brow with a sooty forearm. "Sure, mister. Caldwell likes his horses to have a small C worked into the shoe on the front left. Vain as a peacock, that one. And Pike Stevens, he had me put a cross mark on his horse's shoes. Said it was for luck. Fool idea. A horseshoe is luck enough. A cross mark." The thread tightened. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was a start, a way to place Stevens's horse where it shouldn't have been. His next stop was far more dangerous. He waited until dark, long after the bank had closed, and slipped into the alley behind it. He wasn't there to see the banker, but his son. John Hartley was a quiet, bookish young man who, unlike his father, carried an air of quiet decency. Eli had seen him at the Mercantile, had noticed the troubled look in his eyes when the town's cruelty was on full display. He was taking a long shot, betting on the son's conscience against the father's power. He tossed a small pebble at John's upstairs window. A few minutes later, the back door creaked open. John Hartley stood there, his face pale in the moonlight. "Rollins, what in God's name are you doing?" he whispered, ushering Eli into a dark storage room that smelled of paper and old ink. "I need to see the loan ledger for Frank Harper," Eli said, "getting straight to it, the real one." John's eyes widened in fear. "I can't. My father would ruin me. He'd disown me." "Your father is about to ruin a good woman based on a lie," Eli said, his voice hard but low. "He's using a forged document to steal her land. You know it, and I know it. You have to decide what kind of man you want to be. John, your father's son, or your own man." The young man wrestled with himself, his fear warring with his integrity. Finally, with a trembling hand, he lit a small lamp. "Wait here." He returned minutes later with a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He opened it to the Harper account. The original entry showed a small loan for seed and supplies, most of which had been paid back. But below it, on a different line, was a newer entry in slightly different ink. It was a massive loan, dated just before Frank's death, with his signature scrawled at the bottom. "It's not his writing," John said, his voice shaking. "I've seen Frank Harper's signature 100 times. It was neat, precise. This is a clumsy forgery. And look at the date. My father added this after Frank was already in the ground." He then pulled out a plat map of the county. Miriam's property was marked in red. The corner of the map, the part detailing the mineral rights for that entire section, had been neatly torn away. "Father's been buying up land all along the creek bed. He thinks there's a silver vein running through here. Miriam's land has the only reliable well. Without her water rights, his plan is worthless." The pieces clicked into place. The rumors, the robbery, the fire, the foreclosure. It was all one single, monstrous plan to get Miriam's land. As Eli was leaving, John stopped him. "There's more. My father, he has Frank's old pistol. He told Deputy Wade he was holding it as collateral for the loan. He's telling people Frank threatened him with it. I heard him say it was the perfect evidence to have, in case the widow caused any more trouble." Eli's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a land grab, it was a frame-up, designed to utterly destroy her. He found his other allies in unexpected places. He visited Mrs. Chen, the seamstress, a quiet woman who was herself an outcast due to her heritage. Her shop was next to the telegraph office, and the walls were thin. She had overheard a conversation between Caldwell and Deputy Wade. "Banker man tell Deputy he has done a fine job making the widow's life difficult. "Mrs." Chen recounted, her hands never stopping their needlework. He say, "One more push, and she will break." He gave Wade a heavy coin pouch for his discretion. His last visit was to Doc Winters. The fire had changed the doctor. The cowardice had been burned out of him, replaced by a quiet shame. When Eli asked him to sign an affidavit, a sworn statement saying he saw Tom Garrett and Pike Stevens at Miriam's barn before the fire fully engulfed it, and that he saw them leading the stallion away, the doctor agreed without hesitation. "It's the least I can do," Winters said, his hand steady as he signed the paper. "My silence has been a sickness in this town for too long." Armed with these truths, Eli felt a grim sense of purpose, but he knew that facts were small, fragile things in a town that preferred the heft of a good rumor. The final push that Caldwell had spoken of came on Sunday. The old church, led by a fire and brimstone preacher who saw sin in every shadow, had organized a community prayer meeting for the town's moral well-being. It was a thinly veiled public trial of Miriam Harper. Eli went with her. He didn't ask. He simply showed up at her door that morning, his own Sunday clothes brushed clean. "You shouldn't go alone," he said. When they walked into the church, a wave of silence and hostile stares washed over them. They sat in a pew near the back. The preacher's sermon was a long, thinly veiled attack on women of loose morals and those who bring misfortune upon a godly community. Every eye was on Miriam. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the simple wooden cross at the front of the church. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She absorbed their judgment with a strength that seemed to unnerve them. After the sermon, the preacher invited members of the congregation to speak their hearts. Chester Morrison stood up, then Tom Garrett, each adding their own poison, talking about her supposed debts, her unfriendliness, her bad luck. It was an avalanche of petty grievances and outright lies, designed to bury her. Finally, the preacher turned to her. "Mrs. Harper, do you have anything to say in your defense? Will you not repent and ask this community for forgiveness?" Miriam rose slowly. The entire church held its breath. Eli's hand instinctively went to the signed statement from Doc Winters in his pocket, ready to fight for her. But she didn't look at him. She looked out at the faces of her neighbors, the people who had known her for years, and her voice, when it came, was not pleading. It was as clear and steady as a well-struck bell. "I have nothing to defend," she said simply, "and I will not ask for forgiveness for misfortunes I did not cause. All I ask is that you look at my daughter, and then look into your own hearts, and ask yourselves if the God you worship would find any pride in what you are doing here today." She then sat down. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer hostile. It was heavy with shame. A few people, most notably the blacksmith and his wife, bowed their heads, unable to meet her gaze. The public shaming had failed. Her dignity had been a shield they could not penetrate. As they walked out of the church, Eli felt a profound shift within himself. He had come to Dry Creek to mend his own broken past with solitude and hard work, but he now saw that true redemption wasn't found in hiding from the world's ugliness. It was found in standing against it. He had the proof in his pocket and a small band of allies. It wasn't much, but against the weight of a torn map and a banker's greed, it would have to be enough. The fight for Miriam Harper's honor had become his own. *******. Part 5. The Cottonwood by the Creek *****. The walk from the church left a bitter taste in Eli's mouth, the kind that dust and righteousness can't wash away. Miriam's quiet defiance had won her a moment of grudging silence, but Eli knew that silence in Dry Creek was never peaceful. It was the quiet of a predator gathering itself to strike again. He saw it in the narrowed eyes of Clay Caldwell as the banker climbed into his fine buggy. A look that promised retribution. He saw it in the way Deputy Wade casually rested a hand on the butt of his pistol as they passed. The air was thick with unspoken threats. "They won't let this go," Eli said. his voice low as they reached her small, scarred homestead. The church was a public humiliation for them. They'll answer it. Miriam looked at the home she had fought so hard to hold together. "This is my home, Eli. I won't be run out of it." "I'm not talking about running," he countered, his gaze sweeping the scorched hills around them. Now a perfect cover for any kind of mischief. "I'm talking about surviving. They'll come at night. They won't be quoting scripture when they do." He looked at Sarah, who was holding her mother's hand, her small face clouded with a confusion that broke his heart. "Come to my place. Just for a few days, until we can bring the proof we have to the circuit judge. It's isolated. It's defensible." He could see the war in her eyes. Every instinct she had was screaming for self-reliance, to not accept another debt, to not put herself under another man's roof and protection. It was the pride of a woman who had been forced to stand alone for too long. But when she looked down at her daughter, her pride faltered. "Just for a few days," she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. The ride to his ranch was a silent retreat from a battlefield. Dry Creek, with its simmering hatred, shrank behind them, and the vast, empty landscape of the high plains opened up. Eli's homestead was nestled in a small valley, protected on 3 sides by rocky mesas. It wasn't much a sturdy, one-room cabin he'd built himself, a solid barn, and a well-tended corral. It was a place of solitude and work, not comfort. The only sign of softness was a massive old cottonwood tree that grew beside the winding, nearly dry creek bed, its leaves whispering in the slightest breeze. As soon as they arrived, Sarah's weariness seemed to fall away. While Eli settled the horses, she ran to the creek bed, her small shoes sinking into the sand, and began collecting smooth, flat stones. For the first time in days, Eli heard her laugh, a small, clear sound that seemed to bring a little life back to the parched land. That evening, a profound quiet settled over the small valley. After a simple meal of beans and bacon cooked over an open fire, Miriam put a sleeping Sarah to bed inside the cabin. She came back out and sat on a log opposite Eli, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the desert air began to cool. The fire crackled between them, and the moon, nearly full, cast long, sharp shadows from the mesas. Above them, the leaves of the great cottonwood rustled, a sound like a gentle, constant sigh. For a long time they just sat, watching the flames. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they hadn't said, every fear and every hope that had passed between them in the last few weeks. "I'm a burden to you, Eli," Miriam said finally, her voice so low it was almost lost to the whisper of the leaves. "My troubles, they've stuck to you like mud. You should have ridden away that first day in the store." "Maybe," he said, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the dancing fire. "I have nothing to offer in return," she went on, her voice tight with a fierce, painful pride. "I'm a widow with a scandal for a shadow. To tie yourself to me is to tie yourself to a sinking stone. I'm afraid of what I owe you. I'm afraid of being in another man's debt." Eli finally looked up, his gray eyes catching the firelight. "Do you think this is about debt?" He shook his head, a small, weary gesture. "Miriam, I haven't been an honest man my whole life. I've made mistakes. I've ridden away from things when I should have stayed. For a long time. I thought living alone, minding my own business, was the best I could do, a way to cause no more harm." He paused, searching for the right words. "But watching you, watching what they're doing to you, it's made me realize that minding your own business is just another way of letting the bad men win. I'm not helping you because I want you to owe me something. I'm doing it because it's the first time in a long time I've felt like the man I'm supposed to be." His confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. He was afraid, too, not of what the town would do to him, but that he wasn't good enough to be her champion, that the flaws in his own past made him an unworthy protector. The night grew colder. A gust of wind rustled the cottonwood leaves more loudly and sent a shower of sparks up from the fire. Miriam shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter, without thinking. Eli stood up, took off his heavy canvas coat, and walked around the fire. He gently draped it over her shoulders. His hands lingered for a moment on the coarse fabric, his knuckles brushing the side of her neck. His touch was hesitant, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. She looked up at him in the flickering firelight. He could see the exhaustion and the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, there was a deep well of strength and a glimmer of something else, something she had kept fiercely guarded trust. Her breath caught in her throat. The air between them became charged, still and intimate. The whole world shrank to the small circle of firelight under the whispering tree. Slowly, as if asking a question, he leaned down. She met him halfway, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was achingly gentle. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of profound recognition. It was shy and tentative, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared battles, the unspoken understanding, the deep, weary relief of no longer being alone. It tasted of wood smoke and dust and the faintest hint of salt from a tear she didn't realize had fallen. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his hands still on her shoulders, holding her as if she were the most fragile, precious thing in the world. "I won't let them touch you with their filth again," he promised, his voice a hoarse whisper that was carried away by the wind. "I swear it." The next morning, the fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered by a child's discovery. Eli was in the barn, showing Sarah one of his gentler mares, a calm buckskin with a soft nose. He lifted her up so she could stroke the horse's neck. As he set her down, her attention was caught by a piece of tack hanging on the wall, an old, worn saddle. Not his own, but one he'd acquired in a trade months ago and hadn't used since. Sarah walked over to it, her small finger tracing a pattern tooled into the leather skirt. It was a distinctive design, a cross with a second, smaller bar etched across its center. "This is a funny saddle," she said, her childish voice echoing slightly in the quiet barn. "It has a mark on it, like the one on Mr. Garrett's horse." Eli froze. Miriam, who had come to the barn door to call them for breakfast, stopped beside him. They both stared at the saddle, then at each other. "What did you say?" sweetheart Miriam asked, her voice tight. "It's like Mr. Garrett's mark," Sarah repeated, tracing it again. "From the Double K Ranch. I saw the blacksmith making one for him once." Eli lifted the saddle off the wall, his hands suddenly feeling clumsy. He turned it over in the morning light slanting through the barn door. It wasn't just a similar mark. Burned deep into the leather under the flap was the clear brand of the Double K Ranch. He remembered the man he'd gotten it from, a drifter passing through, desperate for a few dollars, who claimed he'd won it in a card game. Eli hadn't thought twice about it, but now the story seemed thin, too thin. This saddle didn't belong to a drifter. It belonged on Pike Stevens's ranch. A cold certainty washed over him. This was it. This was the piece that didn't fit, the hard evidence that tied Garrett and Stevens to something more than just petty theft and bullying. A saddle like this, discarded and sold cheap, could have been used in the payroll robbery. It was a direct, physical link from the crime that had started all of Miriam's trouble straight to the doorstep of her primary tormentors. The quiet intimacy of the night before, the promise made under the cottonwood tree, was gone. It was replaced by the harsh, clarifying light of day. Their brief moment of peace was over. The sanctuary had given them not just shelter, but a weapon. And Eli knew, with a grim and resolute certainty, that the time for hiding was over. It was time to ride back into the storm. *******. Part 6. The Wind on the Wooden Bridge. *****. The Double K saddle sat in the center of Eli's cabin floor like a dark accusation. It was more than a clue. It was a key. The news from John Hartley, delivered by a trusted ranch hand who rode out under the cover of darkness. Was the lock it was meant to turn? Clay Caldwell, impatient and arrogant, was moving his first major shipment of silver ore out of a secret exploratory mine in the northern hills. The wagon, heavy and slow, would be forced to cross the old wooden trestle bridge at Devil's Notch, a deep chasm that was a notorious bottleneck and a perfect place for an ambush. Eli understood Caldwell's brutal logic in an instant. The banker wouldn't just have the payroll robbers strike the wagon. He would use the opportunity to finish Miriam for good. A planted letter, a fake confession found on one of the captured or killed robbers, would be all the proof Deputy Wade needed to put a rope around her neck, legally and with the town's blessing. It was a checkmate move, designed to wipe the board clean of all obstacles. But Eli had no intention of playing the banker's game. He rode into Dry Creek before dawn, a man with a plan as hard and clear as granite. He met with his small, unlikely band of allies in the back room of Doc Winter's surgery, the air thick with the scent of carbolic acid and quiet resolve. He'll have Garrett and Stevens hit the wagon at the bridge. Eli laid out, his voice low and steady, and he'll have a piece of paper in Garrett's pocket with Miriam's name on it. John Hartley, his face pale but determined, nodded. My father is confident. He believes you're all hiding out at your ranch, terrified. We need you both there as witnesses, Eli said, looking from John to the doctor. Legal witnesses. When the circuit judge finally gets here, it'll be your word against Caldwell's. We need to make sure your word is backed by what you see with your own eyes. Doc Winters adjusted his spectacles, his hands surprisingly steady. Getting the whole town to see it would be better. That was where the final piece of the plan fell into place. Eli found Mrs. Chen in her small shop, already working by the light of a single lamp. When he explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. A distraction, she said, her needle pausing for a moment. Tonight, there will be a charity market in the street. For the fire victims. I will organize it. Music, food, lamps. The whole town will be outside, and when the time is right, I will make sure they know where to look. Her smile was thin but sharp as a needle. People are very curious when there is a loud noise. The plan was a long shot, a desperate gamble against power and money. As Eli rode out of town with Miriam and Sarah, heading not for the bridge, but for a high vantage point overlooking the pass, the weight of it all settled on his shoulders. He was asking people to risk everything, their livelihoods, their safety on his word. Devil's Notch was a scar on the face of the earth, a deep, jagged canyon carved by 1,000 years of wind and water. The wooden bridge that spanned it was a skeletal, rickety structure, its timbers groaning with every gust of wind that funneled through the chasm. Eli positioned Miriam and Sarah in a small, sheltered alcove in the rocks, high above the road, hidden from view, but with a clear line of sight to the bridge. He handed Miriam a coil of rope. Remember what I showed you about knots, he asked. She nodded, her face grim. Good. Stay here, no matter what. He looked at Sarah. You be brave for your mother. Little one. He then made his way down to a thicket of damp, hardy brush near the canyon's entrance, a place he'd scouted before. He worked quickly, piling up damp leaves and green wood. He wouldn't start a fire, not a real one. He would make smoke, a thick, disorienting screen that would cling to the canyon floor and force Garrett's men out of their hiding spots. The wait was agonizing. The sun beat down, and the wind moaned through the canyon. Finally, late in the afternoon, Eli heard the telltale rumble and creak of the heavy ore wagon. He lit his smoke pile. The damp brush didn't flame. It smoldered, releasing a thick, white-gray smoke that the wind immediately seized, pushing it down the road and into the mouth of the canyon. As the ore wagon rumbled onto the bridge, figures emerged from the rocks on either side, their forms hazy in the swirling smoke. Pike Stevens and his crew. Eli counted 5 of them. They moved to surround the wagon, their rifles raised. From his hiding place, Eli saw Tom Garrett break from the main group. He wasn't heading for the wagon. He was scrambling up the rocks, his movements quick and sly, heading directly for the alcove where Miriam and Sarah were hidden. A cold dread, sharper than any fear he had felt during the fire, seized Eli. Garrett wasn't just there to rob a wagon. He was there for the final piece of the frame-up. He was there for a hostage. Eli broke cover, his Colt in his hand, and raced up the rocky incline, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was too far. He heard Sarah's terrified cry just as he cleared a rocky outcrop. Garrett was there, in the alcove, his arm locked around Sarah's small body, the barrel of his pistol pressed against her head. Miriam stood frozen, her face a mask of incandescent fury and utter terror. "That's far enough," Rollins Garrett screamed, his voice high and strained above the wind. He began dragging Sarah out onto the bridge itself, putting her between him and Eli. The other outlaws on the bridge turned, their rifles now aimed at this new, unexpected drama. The bridge shuddered under their weight. The wind whipped at their clothes, threatening to tear them from the narrow walkway. Down below, Doc Winters and John Hartley watched from their own hiding place, helpless. "Let the girl go," Garrett Eli yelled, his own voice sounding distant and thin in the vast, windy space. "You should have stayed out of it," Garrett shrieked, his eyes wild with a cornered animal's panic. "Now everyone's going to see the widow's partner get her own girl hurt." But then Miriam began to walk forward, her hands held out in front of her, empty and open. She didn't look at Eli. She didn't look at the gun. She looked directly into Tom Garrett's eyes. "You're a coward." "Tom," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with a strange, piercing clarity over the wind. "You've always been a coward. You follow Pike because you're afraid to stand on your own. You torment a woman and a child because you're afraid of a real fight. Your own men can see it. Look at them. They followed a hard man, not a snake who hides behind a little girl." Her words struck home. Eli saw a flicker of doubt in the eyes of the other outlaws. They were hard men, yes, but there were lines. Garrett's desperate move was crossing one. The moment of hesitation was all Eli needed. He wasn't aiming for Garrett. He was aiming for the wagon. He fired once. The bullet, true and clean, struck the iron pin holding the thick leather retaining strap on the wagon's side. The strap snapped. With a groaning screech of tortured wood and metal, the massive weight of the silver ore shifted. The entire wagon lurched, and a cascade of heavy ore sacks slid across the bed, pinning Pike Stevens's leg against the railing and knocking his rifle from his hands. At that exact moment, two riders galloped out of the smoke at the far end of the bridge. It was Deputy Wade and Clay Caldwell himself, come to supervise their victory. "Drop your weapon," Rollins Wade bellowed, pulling his gun. "You're under arrest." Caldwell, seeing his plan unraveling, his silver spilled, and his hired gun trapped, lost his composure. "Shoot him! You fool!" he screamed at the deputy. "Shoot him now!" "Wade, that was our deal." He used the deputy's first name, the name he would only use in private, the name that sealed their conspiracy. Wade froze, his face going slack with horror. His cover, his authority, was gone, blown away by his own boss's panicked stupidity. And then nature delivered its final, booming verdict, with a sound like a giant spine snapping. A main support cable on the bridge, frayed by age and strained by the shifted weight of the wagon, gave way. The section of the bridge where Garrett stood with Sarah dropped, planks splintering, and plunged downwards. Without a thought, Eli launched himself forward. He leaped into the empty space, tackling Sarah, wrapping his body around hers as the world fell away beneath them. He managed to grab hold of a thick, splintered beam as the section of bridge slammed to a halt, dangling precariously over the chasm. They were suspended in midair, the wind howling around them, Sarah sobbing in terror against his chest. Eli Miriam's voice cut through the chaos. He looked up, She was lying flat on the remaining, stable part of the bridge, her arm outstretched. In her hand was the rope, a perfect loop at its end, just as he had taught her. She threw it. It sailed through the wind, a lifeline, and he snagged it with his free hand. "Pull!" she screamed. John Hartley was suddenly there beside her, grabbing the rope, his face strained with effort. Together, they began to haul the dead weight of Eli and the child up from the abyss. On the collapsing section, Garrett, who had managed to cling to a broken rail, saw Deputy Wade turn his horse to flee, with a final, venomous curse. Garrett raised his pistol and shot the deputy in the back. Wade tumbled from his saddle and lay still. Garrett, his leg trapped in the wreckage, was finished. Just as Eli and Sarah were pulled to safety, a great crowd of people, the entire population of Dry Creek, appeared at the canyon's edge. Drawn from Mrs. Chen's street market by the sound of the gunshot, they arrived in time to see Clay Caldwell, his face a mask of apoplectic rage, being confronted by Doc Winters, who held up his sworn affidavit. "This man hired these thieves! Clay!" the doctor's voice boomed, filled with a righteous fury. "He forged loan documents. I saw his men steal the widow's horse. It's over." The town stood in stunned silence, the wind whipping at them, the truth laid bare in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. Caldwell, surrounded and exposed, finally broke. It was Miriam who spoke into the silence. She stood up, her face smudged with dirt, her hair wild from the wind, her daughter now clinging to her side. She faced the people of Dry Creek, the people who had judged her, whispered about her, and condemned her. Her voice was strong, and it carried over the wind to every single person. "I don't need anyone to wash away my sins," she declared, her eyes sweeping over their faces. "I was never guilty of any. All I ever needed was for you to stop listening to lies and look at the truth." She pulled her daughter closer. "This is the truth. A greedy man, a cowardly deputy, and a town that was too quick to believe the worst. Look at it. Look at it hard." No one spoke. For the first time in over a year, the town of Dry Creek was utterly, completely silent, shamed by the truth on the edge of a broken bridge. ###**. Part 7. After the great wind, justice, honor, and a home ****. The wind still howled through Devil's Notch, but its voice had changed. It no longer carried the sound of chaos and fear, but of a vast, unnerving silence. The townspeople stood clustered on the canyon's edge, a scattered congregation of witnesses, their faces pale in the fading light. Below them, the broken bridge hung like a monument to the lies that had nearly torn their community apart. Clay Caldwell didn't rage or plead. The banker, stripped of his power and prestige in a single, catastrophic afternoon, seemed to shrink before their eyes. It was Gus the blacksmith and a few other stoic men who wordlessly took him into custody, their movements grim and efficient, to hold him in the town's small jail until the marshal from the next county could be summoned. Tom Garrett, his leg broken and his face a mask of pain and defeat, was hauled from the wreckage and bound. The body of Deputy Wade lay covered by a blanket, a final, sordid postscript to a story of greed. In the days that followed, Dry Creek held its breath. The silence that had fallen at the bridge settled over the town, but this time it was a thoughtful quiet, heavy with introspection and shame. People went about their business with their eyes downcast, the usual hum of gossip and speculation replaced by a new, awkward courtesy. When the circuit judge, a stern, hawk-faced man named Elias Thorne, finally rode into town, he found a community ready for judgment mostly on itself. The preliminary hearing was held not in a stuffy courtroom, but in the open air, in the shadow of the Mercantile. Judge Thorne listened, his expression unreadable, as John Hartley, with a quiet courage that made his father's blustering seem pathetic, presented the bank's ledgers, pointing out the forged signature and the fraudulent entry. He explained the torn map and the motive of the silver vein that ran beneath Miriam Harper's well. Then Doc Winters stood. He did not just present his affidavit. He spoke to the town, his voice clear and resonant with the weight of a long-overdue confession. For more than a year, I have allowed my own fear to poison the truth in this town, he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors. I knew Frank Harper died of a swift and terrible fever. I knew the whispers about his wife were born of malice, not medicine. I remained silent. When I saw Tom Garrett and Pike Stevens at her barn on the night of the fire, I said nothing. My silence made me complicit. It made all of us who listened to the gossip and did nothing complicit. The sickness in Dry Creek wasn't a fever or a drought. It was us. He turned to Miriam, who stood beside Eli, her daughter's hand held tight in her own. Mrs. Harper, the doctor said, his voice thick with emotion, I ask for your forgiveness. The judge brought his gavel down on a makeshift table. The sound was sharp, final. He declared the foreclosure notice null and void. He officially dismissed Miriam Harper as a person of interest in the payroll robbery, citing the overwhelming evidence of a conspiracy orchestrated by Clay Caldwell. Her name was cleared. Her land, her home, and her water rights were unequivocally hers. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the crowd. Justice, it turned out, was a clean, simple sound. But a legal decree could not mend a broken roof or heal a wounded spirit. The community's restitution began not with a proclamation, but with a quiet conversation. A new minister had arrived in town a week earlier, a thoughtful man named Reverend Ashford, who had taken over for the fire and brimstone preacher. He had watched the drama unfold with a sad, knowing eye. He approached Miriam and Eli outside the mercantile after the hearing. Mrs. Harper, he began, his voice gentle. A town's honor is like a house. When one part of the foundation is rotten, the whole structure suffers. The foundation has been repaired today. Now, it's time to fix the roof. The following Sunday, he didn't preach about sin. He spoke of redemption. He spoke of the simple, practical work of being a neighbor. And he announced that on the following Saturday, anyone who wished to help a neighbor in need should show up at the Harper homestead with a hammer, a saw, or a willingness to work. Eli had expected a handful of people to show, perhaps the doctor, the blacksmith, Mrs. Chen. But on that Saturday morning, as the sun rose over the scorched hills, they came, a steady stream of them, walking or riding in wagons. Chester Morrison and his wife arrived first, their faces grim, and silently unloaded a wagon full of new lumber, flour, sugar, and coffee. They didn't apologize in words. Their offering did it for them. Then came Gus the blacksmith, his sons, and a dozen other men. The women of the town arrived with baskets of food, setting up tables under the shade of a surviving oak tree. It was an awkward, beautiful, and deeply human affair. Men who had once sneered at Miriam now sweated under the sun, their hammers ringing in a steady rhythm as they tore off the burned sections of her barn and laid new timber. Women who had whispered behind their hands now worked side by side with her, sorting salvageable items and organizing the new supplies. No one spoke of the past. They spoke of the angle of a roof beam, the need for more nails, the heat of the day. They were rebuilding more than a barn. They were rebuilding trust, one plank and one shared meal at a time. Eli worked alongside them, a quiet leader, but he found his greatest joy in watching Sarah, the little girl, who had been so silent and solemn, was now the center of a small, charmed circle. Gus's wife showed her how to churn butter, Mrs. Chen taught her a simple cat's cradle with a piece of string. She was a child again. Eli had brought over one of his own mares, a steady, good-natured 4-year-old, to replace the stolen stallion. It was his gift to her, a new start. In a quiet moment amidst the hammering, he lifted Sarah onto the mare's bare back. He led the horse in a slow, careful circle, his hand firm on the bridle, her small hands clutching the mane. her initial fear melting into a wide, delighted grin. Miriam watched from the porch, her hand over her mouth, her eyes shining with tears of a kind she hadn't shed in a very long time. That evening, as the last of the work crew departed, leaving behind a nearly finished barn and a sense of profound, weary peace, Eli helped Miriam hang a new set of curtains in the cabin. He was a man who could build a house from scratch and gentle a wild horse. But the simple act of threading a curtain onto a rod seemed to be beyond him. He fumbled with the fabric, his large, calloused fingers clumsy and awkward. "Here," Miriam said, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips for the first time. She took the curtain from him and deftly finished the job in seconds. "You're better with horses than with houses. It seems so," he admitted, a sheepish grin spreading across his own face. They stood there for a moment in the soft lamplight of her repaired home, the scent of fresh-cut wood in the air, and shared a look of simple, uncomplicated contentment. A few days later, when the last nail had been hammered and the last tool put away, Eli asked Miriam and Sarah to ride with him. He didn't say where they were going. He led them away from the town, away from the mended scars of her property, back to the quiet solitude of his own small valley. He led them to the giant cottonwood tree that stood sentinel by the dry creek bed. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. He dismounted and helped them down. He and Miriam stood under the whispering leaves while Sarah, ever curious, went to search for more of her favorite smooth stones in the creek bed. "The creek's still dry," Eli said, his voice quiet. "But the rains will come. They always do. Eventually." He turned to face her. His face was serious, his gray eyes steady. He took her hands in his. They were no longer the hands of a desperate woman, but the hands of a survivor, strong and capable. "Miriam?" he began, his voice a little rough. "I'm not a man with a lot of fine words. I live a simple life, and it can be a hard life. The winds blow, the rains fail, the sun beats down. There's always another fight on the horizon." He took a deep breath. "I've spent a lot of years facing those things alone, and I've watched you face them alone. I don't think either of us has to do that anymore." He looked into her eyes, his heart in his own. "I'm not offering you an easy life. I want to be the man standing beside you the next time a storm comes. I want it so that whatever happens, good or bad, you don't have to face it by yourself." He paused, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "Miriam Harper, will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but her gaze was as steady and strong as his. She had fought for her home, for her honor, for her daughter. This man had fought beside her. He wasn't offering to rescue her. He was offering to stand with her. It was the only proposal she could have ever accepted. "Yes, Eli," she whispered, her voice thick but unwavering. "Yes." Their wedding ring was not made of gold or silver. Eli went to Gus the blacksmith, who took a piece of simple, strong iron and, with his own hands, forged it into a plain, unadorned band. It was a symbol of their bond, not fancy or delicate, but solid, durable, and crafted from the heart of the community they had helped to heal. It was a promise made to last. ###****, Part 7. The Path Forward. One family. A different West, ****. The first autumn rain came not as a storm, but as a promise. It fell for a whole day and night, a soft, steady drumming on the new roofs of Miriam's home and barn. It was a gentle, cleansing rain that washed the last of the ash from the scorched hillsides and turned the red dust of the creek bed into dark, thirsty mud. By the next morning, the sun rose on a world that felt washed clean, and for the first time in over a year, a thin, silver trickle of water ran through the sand of the creek beside Eli's cabin, its quiet gurgling the sweetest music the valley had heard in a long time. It was by the side of this newly born creek, under the watchful gaze of the old cottonwood tree, that they were married. There was no formal church service, no grand reception. Their wedding was as honest and unadorned as the land itself. Miriam wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, the one Mrs. Chen had helped her mend and press, and in her hair, she wore a crown of the tiny yellow wildflowers that had sprung up along the creek bank after the rain. Sarah, wearing a bright new ribbon in her hair, held a small, clumsy bouquet of the same flowers for her mother. Eli stood beside them, his best clothes feeling stiff and unfamiliar, his gaze never leaving Miriam's face. Reverend Ashford officiated, his words simple and direct, speaking not of divine judgment, but of human resilience, of faith not in heaven alone, but in each other. Their vows were not flowery promises, but quiet statements of fact. "I will stand with you," Eli said, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't try to hide as he slipped the plain iron ring onto her finger. "And I with you," Miriam replied, her eyes clear and bright, her hand steady as she accepted his. The guest list was a quiet test of the town's mended heart. There were no written invitations, only a general understanding, a shared knowledge that this was happening. And so they came. Doc Winters stood as Eli's witness, his posture straight, a quiet smile on his face. John Hartley was there, having finally earned his own name, separate from his father's tarnished legacy. Mrs. Chen came, and Gus the blacksmith with his whole family, his booming laugh a welcome sound in the quiet valley. Even Chester Morrison and his wife made the journey. They stood at the back of the small gathering, their presence a silent, awkward apology, which was, in its own way, more meaningful than any words they could have offered. They didn't stay for the celebration, but their attendance was noted by all. It was a beginning. The wedding feast was laid out on blankets spread on the ground pots of hearty bean stew, fresh-baked cornbread, and apple pies from the first of the autumn harvest. It was a meal of substance, not of show, and as the small community shared the food, the last of the stiffness and shame that had plagued Dry Creek seemed to dissolve in the warm afternoon sun. A week later, a letter arrived for Reverend Ashford from the territorial prison. He read it aloud from his pulpit the following Sunday. It was from Tom Garrett. The spelling was poor and the grammar clumsy, but the message was clear. It was a public confession and an apology, addressed not to the law, but to Miriam. He wrote of his own cowardice, of being led by Pike Stevens and intimidated by Caldwell's money. He admitted to planting the shawl and to the plan to use Sarah as a hostage. He asked for nothing. Not forgiveness or pity, but simply stated that he wanted the truth to be on the record, written in his own hand. It was a small, final twist of the knife that severed the last thread of the old lies. The town was changing. The change wasn't loud or sudden. It was a series of quiet, deliberate actions. It was in the way Chester Morrison now gave fair weight and honest prices. It was in the way people now met Miriam's eyes in the street and offered a genuine greeting. It was in the way they talked about the weather, their crops, and their children, the venomous well of gossip having finally run dry. The most significant change began with a meeting at Eli's ranch. He and Miriam had invited a dozen of the small ranchers and farmers from the surrounding area, men who had been hit just as hard by the drought. Eli unrolled an old map on his cabin table. "Caldwell was right about one thing," Eli said, his finger tracing the path of the creek. "The water is the key. But it doesn't belong to one man to be hoarded. It belongs to all of us." He laid out a simple, ambitious plan. If they worked together, they could dig a series of irrigation channels, diverting a small, sustainable amount of water from the main creek during the wet season to feed their individual lands. It would be backbreaking work, requiring them to pool their resources, their animals, and their labor. It would require trust. "We can try to survive alone and watch our neighbors fail," Eli concluded, his gaze moving from one weathered face to the next. "Or we can work together and see if we can all rise with the water." There was a long silence. These were men bred on independence, suspicious of charity and collective efforts. But they had all seen what happened when one man's greed was allowed to fester. They had seen what happened when neighbors turned on each other, and they had seen what Eli Rollins had done for a woman he barely knew. Gus the blacksmith was the first to speak. "My boys and I have strong backs," he boomed, "and my forge can make the tools. Tell us where to dig." One by one, they all agreed. Justice, they were learning, wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about building something better in the aftermath. The Dry Creek Irrigation Cooperative was born not of contracts and legal papers, but of a simple handshake in a small cabin, a promise to share not just water, but a future. Life settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by the seasons and the demands of hard, hopeful work. Miriam's homestead was no longer a place of isolated struggle, with their lands combined. It was a thriving ranch, the sound of Eli's horses mingling with the clucking of Miriam's chickens. The house was small, but filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple over the mesas, Eli sat on the new porch he had built, an old, battered guitar resting in his lap. He wasn't a skilled musician, but he picked out a slow, simple melody, the notes drifting out into the cool, clear air. Miriam came and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder, her work-weary body relaxing against his, in the yard in front of them. Sarah wasn't just walking, she was dancing, skipping and twirling in circles, her laughter as free and natural as the evening breeze. She was chasing fireflies, her small hands cupping the tiny, blinking lights before letting them go again. Eli's fingers stilled on the strings. He looked at the woman leaning against him, her strength a quiet, steady presence. He looked at the child dancing in the twilight, her joy a beacon of everything they had fought for. He thought of the long, dusty road that had led him here, a journey that had begun with a simple, desperate need. "I rode into that town for nothing more than a sack of grain, a simple need to keep my horses and my solitary life alive. I left with a widow who showed me what it meant to stand for something, a woman who altered the path of my life, and in doing so, we, along with a few other decent folk, ended up altering the path of Dry Creek itself, just a little. We learned that justice isn't always found in the flash of a gun, but in the slow, stubborn persistence of good people. And that love is the simple, sacred work of choosing to stand together, facing the wind, and building a home." Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our journey to Dry Creek, please consider subscribing to the channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support the channel, hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.